Hey everyone, my name is Ryan, and in this video I'll be showing you an editing breakdown for this image. I'll be covering how I created the 3D background inside of Blender, as well as how I combined it with the original photo inside of Photoshop. I first begin by bringing my image into Photoshop, and then proceeding to cut my subject out from the background. I did this using Photoshop's Select Subject feature, which usually makes a great starting point. With my subject selected, I added a layer mask to the image. From here, I used a standard brush tool. With the layer mask selected, I began cleaning up the edges of my cutout. You can be as meticulous as you'd like in this step, but most of the time I'm pretty rough with it and I don't want to waste too much time on this process. To make sure my perspective was correct, I opened the original image inside of a program called FSpy. Once I solved the camera perspective, I then saved the file and imported it into Blender using the FSpy to Blender add-on, which automatically creates a camera with the proper perspective set. To make sure my camera was in a good spot, I used a 3D model of a human as a reference and matched up the subject in my camera background image with the model, making sure to maintain the perspective and angle that was originally set up from FSpy. The first steps I took in building my scene was to block things out with basic primitive meshes and get some lights into the scene. Using basic objects such as cubes and planes as a starting point, you can very quickly define the primary shapes and layout of your scene. This basic blockout will be the basis of everything else you do here, so it's important to get a strong looking composition at this stage, and this will just make the rest of your steps go much quicker and easier. You can think of this as a rough draft sketch within 3D space. If you're good at digital painting, you could also block things out inside of Photoshop as well. My idea for this scene was relatively simple, so my blockout stage basically consisted of placing one big plane and adding a few lights. In terms of lighting, it's very important to relatively match the lighting of your original photograph so that your final edit will feel more cohesive and fitting. When taking the photo, I wasn't sure what I wanted the scene to be, but I really liked the lighting setup, so I had to get it to make sense in the 3D stage. At this point, I thought that the source of the red light on my subject could be coming from some Roadflares, and then I decided to add a bluish street light or moonlight to help give some color contrast, and that was the basis of the lighting that I set up in 3D. I then added a basic grunge texture to the ground plane as my starting point for texturing. I then subdivided the mesh several times and began extruding out random faces, warping, moving, and rotating randomly to introduce some physical imperfections to the ground. Next, I added a displacement modifier with a noise texture, playing around with the scale and strength until I got some overall warping to the ground that I was happy with. Adding physical imperfections such as warping the geometry is a very often overlooked step, and it can help add a lot of realism to your 3D renders. Nothing in real life is perfect, so nothing in 3D should be perfect either. The next step in my texturing process was adding decals to the ground. Decals are essentially images of details, such as ground cracks, dirt, stains, etc., that you can import into your scene and place them above surfaces to help introduce more details and visual interest. I'll create a video at a later time that goes more in depth on how to create your own decals in Photoshop and using them inside of Blender. Once I imported the decals into the scene, I adjusted the materials to look a bit better, and then started placing them throughout my scene. Since these decals are on flat planes, I needed to do some extra steps to get them to sit snug against the ground, following the displacement of the ground's geometry. To help with this, I first subdivided the decal mesh several times, and then I added a shrink wrap modifier, using the ground as the target object. Decals such as these ground cracks and street markings go a long way in creating large amounts of detail with minimal effort. Next, I started populating my scene with some 3D models of concrete blocks and pillars. I wasn't really sure where I wanted to take this, so you'll see me moving things around quite a bit at this stage. I really should have spent more time in the blockout phase when I first started, as it would have helped me out greatly, and I wouldn't have wasted so much time trying to figure things out right now. Going back into my render view to see how things looked, I realized it was missing some atmospheric haze. To help with that, I created a cube, scaled it up to be just barely bigger than my entire 3D scene, and then going into the shader editor, I removed the default material and added in a volume scatter node, connecting it to the volume socket of the material. I then turned the density down to something around 0.05%. I didn't want it to look foggy, I just wanted barely enough haze to give a little light scattering within the scene. After setting that up, I started adjusting the positioning of the objects, decals, and lights in my scene. I was liking the idea, but something about it just wasn't feeling right to me. I decided I didn't like the concrete pillars and blocks that I initially brought in, so I replaced them with some concrete barriers that I got from Quixel Megascans. I really liked the detail and the look of them, but I wanted the scene to feel a little bit more beat up. So I started bringing in more assets, such as piles of concrete debris and rocks. I then started placing some scanned ground assets that I got from Ian Hubert's Patreon, which I highly suggest checking out if you want to get a lot of really great assets to use in your renders. I also found some photoscanned debris models on ArtStation that at the time of this video are completely free. While it's no replacement for custom modeling or hand modeling things in 3D, Using photoscanned assets, also known as photogrammetry, is definitely a best way to get the most amount of realistic detail in your scene with the least amount of effort and time. You can find a ton of free and relatively inexpensive photogrammetry assets on ArtStation and Sketchfab. I recommend grabbing a bunch of them over time and building up a library of objects that you can use over and over in your projects. At this point, my 3D scene was finished and I kicked out a render. I still needed to create a render of a pistol, since I didn't have one to use as a prop during the photo shoot. So I found this 3D model of a pistol for free off Sketchfab from this person right here. The first steps here are pretty much the same as before. I imported a camera along with the background image, and I made sure the perspective was set properly. I then brought in the downloaded 3D model of the pistol, set up the materials, lined the gun up so that it matches with where the subject's hand was, and then I roughly matched the lighting that was used in the original photograph. I rendered out two versions of this pistol, one with the normal lighting that I just set up, and another with just the ambient lighting. This is so I can more easily paint in the shadows inside of Photoshop. Back inside Photoshop, I began the process of doing some skin cleanup just using the standard healing brush, and then I did a little dodge and burn to give some extra pop to my subject. I usually do these two steps in the very beginning, but it didn't matter too much in this workflow. You might notice throughout the editing process, the colors either go black and white or super saturated, or the exposure is turned way up and down. These are a set of global adjustments called check layers that are usually used to help with the compositing process, which allow you to better match the colors and levels of the various elements in your scene. I'll create a video at a later time that goes over how to create these check layers and how to use them in your workflow. If your subject's feet are visible in the image you want to composite, then you'll probably want to either manually paint in some shadows, or in my case, I used the original shadows from the photo. To do this, I created a copy of the original photo, cut out the portion of the image that contained the shadow around the feet, I added a feathered layer mask, and then played around the blending modes and colors of the layer until it looked right. It's important when you do this step that the shadow's black point, which is the darkest point of the shadow, isn't darker than the black point of the rest of the subject or that part of the image. Matching the levels of exposure, black points, and white points is a very important part of compositing, which I'll be creating a video on in more depth. Once I brought the 3D render of the pistol, I began in painting the shadows where they were needed. This is where the second render of the pistol came in handy. The version of the pistol that had all of the lights turned off except for the ambient lighting acted as the shadow. To use it, I simply added an inverted layer mask to it so it's invisible, and then painting on that layer mask with white, I was able to paint in the shadows. This is an easy technique you can do with your 3D renders if you know you'll be needing to add some shadows in during the compositing steps. Next, I use a levels and hue and saturation adjustment layer to match the colors and levels of my subject a little bit better. By bringing up the exposure in my check layers, it brought to my attention that my subject had far more noise in the shadows than my 3D renders. To help the renders match my subject, I could have done one of two things, either denoise my subject, or in my case, I added a layer of noise to my 3D renders of the pistol and background. It's a very subtle change, but a good composite is made up of a series of small and subtle changes that make a big impact in the end. For the Roadflares, I was too lazy to find or make a 3D model, so I simply grabbed an image of some Roadflares that I found on Google, cut them out, and brought them into my image. I ended up messing around with the levels and colors quite a bit to get them to match, so much so that in hindsight, I probably should have just done this in 3D. Next, I added some smoke coming off the flares using smoke assets from cghacks.com. A bit of a shameless plug here, this is a company that I'm working with where we offer high-end assets and overlays for photographers and artists who do this type of work. We're still in the early stages of things, but we have a lot of great stuff planned for the future, such as in-depth editing and photography courses, so please go check out the website when you can. Again, this is cghacks.com. So back to the edit. To help me get these smoke assets to more closely match and fit into my image, I added a levels adjustment to match the exposure and black point and white point levels, and then colorized the assets using a hue saturation adjustment layer clipped to the smoke layer. And to better blend these smoke assets into the image, I added a new layer above it set to screen, sampled some of the background colors from around the smoke, and I used a big soft brush to paint in some glow around the edges of the smoke. I then proceeded to add the last finishing touches of some atmospherics such as smoke, haze, lens flares, glows, and light leaks. Again, most of these are all ones that I've used from cghacks.com. Whenever you are using overlays such as these, it's easy to go overboard with it. I generally get the overlays to a point that I like, and then dial the strength of them down by about 20 to 40%. At this point in the editing process, I merged all visible layers into a new layer on top of everything, and then I began my color grading process. It's best to think of the color grading process in composites the same way you would for an image that you took with a photograph. All of the work prior to this is simply getting everything in your image to match and feel as one cohesive piece. But just like a photo that you take straight from your camera, it can always benefit from playing around and adjusting the colors and levels of the entire image as one. Using that merged layer, I opened it up inside of Camera Raw, which is essentially just Lightroom inside of Photoshop, and began adjusting my exposure, levels, colors of my image, as well as adding in some sharpening. I also add in some film grain, which is another important step for making everything in your image feel cohesive and tied together. Finally, after these adjustments, I added a color lookup adjustment layer, which is where you can add in a LUT. A LUT is basically a way that you can push and pull the colors of your image drastically. You can find a lot of great LUT packs online, usually for free. At this point, I'll just cycle through the LUTs that I have in the list until I see something that I like. It's almost always going to be way too strong of an effect, so I'll dial the adjustment layer's opacity down to something like 50% or so. You could also play around with the blending modes of that layer, as well as mixing it and matching it with more than one LUT adjustment layer. And that was the editing process for this image. Guys, thanks for watching. If you liked this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you have any questions at all, let me know down in the comments below. Additionally, I'll be creating a series of quick tips videos where I go over various techniques and such that I use often within my workflows and mention inside of the editing breakdowns such as this. If you want to see more content like this in the future, please consider subscribing. And until next time, stay creative.